The Soul King is the closest thing to a true god in the world of Bleach. Even surrounded by monstrous beings like Aizen and urahara, none scratch the surface of the divinity that Reio himself occupies. A genuine enigma for the vast majority of the series, the Soul King, his existence, his purpose, even his appearance, was one of Bleach's most closely guarded secrets. That was until the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. And while we still don't necessarily have all the answers regarding the royal overseer of Soul Society himself, Kubo blew the doors off the royal palace in the final arc of Bleach, both literally and figuratively, and gave us a decent look at the monarch himself. I think it's safe to say too that even with Aizen hinting way back in the urahara arc that the Soul King wasn't it rather than a him, we didn't quite expect what we'd eventually get. For by the time we get to see the Soul King in Bleach, he finally debuts in chapter 519, there's considerably more to him than meets the eye. Though Kubo wouldn't truly dive into the true nature of the current state of the Soul King himself until the last 100 chapters or so of Bleach, and even then, there's a lot going unaccounted for. What we do get to see and learn, however, is truly interesting, as the Soul King takes on an unexpected form. While his core body may be inanimate, unmoving, even lifeless in appearance, the truth is that he underwent horrific mutilation, and as a result, the body parts that were robbed from him have since gained sentience and become so much more on their own. In the last big video I did on the Soul King, we looked at the man himself from a top-down perspective and everything we knew on him and his history. In this follow-up, I want to go over everything we know regarding the split-apart sentient pieces of the Soul King himself, their role in the wider story, their powers, their abilities, even try and gauge their origins while speculating on and discussing the true nature of the god of Bleach. And it all sounds rather existential when put like that. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. I'm still trying to hit 200,000 subscribers before the anime comes back in July. That would be absolutely amazing to achieve. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And as always, an enormous shout out and a massive everlasting thank you goes out to each and every one of you supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. And of course, there will be some pretty hefty spoilers for the 1,000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach in this video to come. As essentially the progenitor of 3 of the major spiritual races of Bleach, Quincy, Shinigami, and Fullbringer, the Soul King presumably possessed the power that each of them would eventually come to use, even if it didn't take the same literal form as theirs. But it is from him that all things, all races began so long ago. But unlike the beings he watched over, it wasn't Reio's fate, his destiny, to prosper. In fact, as detailed in the light novel Can't Fear Your Own World, the Soul King was dismembered in a brutal fashion by the ancestors of what would later become the 5 noble houses of the Soul Society, simply because they feared his intentions and his immeasurable power. They removed his arms, seemingly just tossing them away with reckless abandon, which is odd considering they know his strength, but perhaps even they didn't think the removed pieces would be so powerful as to eventually gain sentience of their own, and they carved out his heart, whittled away his legs, and inflicted such agony upon him as to leave him in an everlasting state between life and death. Though the Soul King had the power to prevent this easily, he instead allowed it, foreseeing that one day his son would rise up to wreak vengeance upon the ancestors of these criminals, the Shinigami. But while the king himself was left to rot forever in suspended animation, his mere presence holding the 3 worlds apart, keeping them separate, keeping them individually whole, his discarded body parts would, over time, find their own way in the world, essences of Reio continuing to live on. So, let's take a look. The Soul King's right arm is an interesting place to start. According to Ukitake, the arm quite literally fell from the heavens themselves eons ago, likely when it was forcibly removed by the ancestors of the noble houses in the dying days of the primordial age. Considering Soul Society didn't exist yet at that time, at the moment the Soul King himself was ruined, I'm curious about the timeline of events. Was the arm perhaps buried for a while before it gained sentience, and when it finally awoke, had people already begun to settle around it? Did Rukongai exist by the time it gained sentience? How did the right arm even move around? As we see later, the left arm is pretty much immobile, unable to even save itself from falling from the royal palace, so I have to assume the same is true for the right. Regardless, it's introduced to us by Ukitake as a strange, unsightly god worshipped by the people of East Rukongai's 76th district, and that's a long way away from the Seireite, where you have to imagine tales and stories of things like this would be considered mere superstition, mere wives' tales. And we get a fleeting glimpse of the right arm's original appearance. It would appear, as you'd probably expect, to be the literal arm of the king himself, and I've always found this panel in particular to be fascinating. The peculiar clothing the arm is wearing, for example, is this something that was fashioned for it by the people of the Rukongai, or is this what remains of the Soul King's own original attire? It does look suitably regal. I think what I find most intriguing about this image is that it's perhaps the closest look at the Soul King's original form we really get, besides, presumably, his face. Of note as well is that an eye appears on the back of the hand, as opposed to the palm, as we will see with the left arm later on. The Soul King and his collective remains all have a strange eye motif, likely a reference, I would imagine, to the Soul King's all-seeing nature thanks to his true version of the Almighty. Like with the other separated appendages, we don't know a lot about the right arm. At some undetermined point in the past, it chose to take the name of Mimihagi for itself. Whether that was a name it decided on or a name that was given to it by the people is unclear, but what we do know is that it resided in a shrine within the district, and as I mentioned earlier, the arms seem incapable of movement on their own, so I imagine the people erected this shrine around where Mimihagi landed all those years ago. The people of this district would worship their ugly god at this shrine, but it likely resented them early on for what had happened to its original body up in the palace ages before, as the Soul Society was effectively built on the back of Reio's desecration. However, over time, as Mimihagi continued to live among the Shinigami and the souls of Rukongai, it grew affectionate towards them, losing whatever ire it might have and instead listening to their prayers and helping them with their ailments. Eventually, after presumably quite a long time, Mimihagi maybe even grew to care for these people and no longer wanted to see them come to any harm. One day, approximately a few hundred years before the main story of Bleach at least, a young boy called Jushiro Ukitake was dying. There was nothing that could be done for him, and even doctors gave up on the child as he lay foaming at the mouth, his eyes squinted and shut, his time almost at an end. His parents were understandably distraught, but also superstitious, so they took him before Mimihagi's shrine, presenting him to the god and begging for its help. We see a small shot of Mimihagi as it gazes down at Ukitake, and a deal was struck. I kind of wonder if Mimihagi was able to make itself disappear and reappear at will, if it appeared to people all the time, or only when they came before it with an extremely severe circumstance, or if this giant arm was with a curled up fist was basically just standing in this shrine the entire time. Anyway, the rumour going around was that divine protection would be given to those who offer up pieces of themselves, implying this has happened in the past with Mimihagi, so long as it wasn't their eye. Why this is the requirement is unknown, but I'm guessing it maybe has something to do with Mimihagi wanting to feel complete, wanting to feel whole, and he has an eye already, so he doesn't need one of those. That's literally a guess on my part. But Mimihagi agreed to the deal, with Ukitake's parents offering up the boy's damaged lungs in exchange for his life. And so, taking on a different form, perhaps the form Mimihagi uses in the day-to-day to avoid being seen by people, where he effectively becomes a living shadow of sorts, Mimihagi's power essentially replaced Ukitake's lungs, saving his life. The right arm of the Soul King is also known as the right arm of stillness, and it's here we see that power for the first time. It essentially held the dying Ukitake in stasis for hundreds of years, keeping him from the brink of oblivion, even though his body was severely weakened, and he technically should have been dead. The fact that Ukitake was strong enough to eventually become a captain despite this handicap is a testament to his raw spiritual power. The fact Mimihagi can transform into this grotesque, inky, shadow-like being is also never really explained, but Ukitake initially calls it a heteromorphic being. Heteromorphic meaning something that occurs in two or more forms, and its power to transform was obviously known to him. The right arm of the Soul King features in the story during the climactic true death of the Soul King himself in the palace above. Although his body parts have long since separated and gained sentience, the core of Reio himself still resides in the palace and is eventually cut down by Yhwach and then Ichigo. With that core destroyed, the three worlds once separated by the Almighty begin to converge once again, returning to their original state. As a brief aside, I wonder what would have happened if one of the body parts had been destroyed before this main central nexus of the Soul King himself. If they all contain at least some essence of Reio, presumably the tethers holding the worlds apart would have at least been noticeably weakened if, say, Pernida or Mimihagi had been killed before Yhwach and Ichigo struck down Reio. We'll never know, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. Although, considering all three worlds begin to collapse in on each other after the death of this part of Reio, maybe everything important resides in this part of Reio still sealed in the palace. I really have no idea. Anyway, all three worlds are now beginning to converge. However, Ukitake steps in to prevent this at the last second, invoking Mimihagi's power of stillness once more. In order to act as an anchor, an arbiter even, for the right arm, Ukitake enacts the ritual of kamekake, the divine vow or divine possession, offering up the remainder of his internal organs to become a living vessel for the right arm itself. And so, Mimihagi's power moves from its original place of Ukitake's lungs, spreading itself to the rest of his body and eventually completely consuming it. As he becomes the right arm of the Soul King itself, Ukitake's body is covered in strange markings. And when looking like this, I imagine it's probably safe to assume that Ukitake is now essentially a hollowed out shell. He has no internal organs left at all. Mimihagi has made its way through them, taking them all up as offerings, and now Ukitake's body simply exists to house this shadowy black mass that is eventually going to escape him. And it does just that. The essence of Mimihagi eventually bursts forth from Ukitake, escaping his mouth, nose, and eyes to soar towards the palace. We see this shadowy black arm reaching towards the heavens, shattering the seal placed on it, much in the same way the left arm will do later on, as we see the ring encompassing Mimihagi itself breaks away, and it stretches into the sky. The right arm latches onto the Soul King's corpse, and it's here again that we see the power of stillness in play. The right arm is capable of stabilizing the destruction of all three worlds by clasping onto what remains of its former body, and as it does so, it evades Yhwach's own Almighty due to it being a remnant of the owner of the true Almighty power. As I mentioned in my relatively recent video on Yhwach's ultimate goal, the Quincy King was surprised and disgusted to see the right arm of the Soul King had seemingly abandoned both the Soul King's own original vision and the vision of his son too. As we mentioned earlier, Mimihagi has grown fond of the Shinigami and the residents of the Soul Society over the many, many years they've spent together, and no longer wants to see it wiped out. even if the core body of the Soul King still views them as his enemies. As Yhwach tries to reach the Soul King, it seems Mimihagi is capable of blocking him with a shadowy energy wall of sorts while mocking Yhwach, his eye turned upward as though the arm is smirking at him. Yoruichi then tries to seal the right arm in place, which is an interesting thought. Would that have depended on leaving Ugitake's limp body there for all eternity? I suppose it would have eventually been transported up to the palace along with Mimihagi, but I mean, down below, Soifon theorizes that Ukitake only has as long as he has Reiatsu left. So I guess, would this have eventually stopped working at some point? It's hard to say for sure. However, it doesn't matter because thanks to Uryu's intervention, Yhwach succeeds in tearing Mimihagi from the Soul King. And in desperation, Mimihagi turns to attack Yhwach, but the Quincy King effortlessly dispels the hand and absorbs all of its remaining power, destroying what's left of the right arm of the Soul King, seemingly for good. Then there's the left arm of the Soul King, which gets a bit more coverage than the right. Unlike its counterpart, the left arm has no love for the Shinigami, instead remaining loyal to Yhwach and by extension the original body and mind of Reio himself. What's interesting about this is that Yhwach is said to be the progenitor of the Quincy, insofar as the modern-day version that we know today. But the left arm of the Soul King considers itself to be a Quincy too, going so far as to claim it's always been a Quincy. Yet it surely must be considerably older than Yhwach, who I theorise to be around probably 1200 to 1500 years old, whereas the Soul King is at least 1,000,000. There is the question of when the left arm gained sentience. If it came into its own after Yhwach appeared in the world of Bleach, then I suppose it all works out, as it would just be following his word, his guidance at this point. Either that or the left arm isn't a true Quincy, or at least not in the modern sense. Anyway, the left arm of the Soul King presumably gained sentience at some point in the past and was recruited by Yhwach to serve him as a member of his Schutzstaffel, the elite royal guard of the Vandenreich. It's hard to know whether or not the left arm is an original member of the Quincy Empire dating back to the time of the Lichtreich, or if it came into being after Yhwach's first defeat. I would have thought, personally, that the Soul Society would have taken pretty early notice of the fact a disembodied limb of their god was siding with Yhwach if it had been at the battle 1,000 years ago, but there's no real way of knowing. What we do know is that the left arm had strange, unnatural powers even before meeting Yhwach. Where the rest of the Sternritter all have their normal innate Quincy abilities, it was their Schrift that gave them their really strange individual abilities. But for the left arm, these powers manifested themselves as a result of the left arm being known as the left arm of progression, hence its ability to continuously evolve without limit. Upon knowing this, Yhwach bestowed it a Schrift, see the compulsory, though this was nominal and had no actual effect on the arm or its powers. Askin reveals that it was common knowledge among the Sternritter that both Sternritter C and Sternritter M Gerard Valkyrie had their strange abilities prior to gaining a Schrift, leading the rest of the Quincy to speculate on their true nature, which again makes me think they are more than just Quincy, no matter what the left arm thinks. Like Mimihagi before it, the left arm would also go on to take a name for itself to help further establish its own identity, Pernida Pankajaz. Going back to the question of whether or not Pernida was a part of the army during the first 1,000 years ago, another reason I'm inclined to believe it probably wasn't is because when it faces Mairi in battle in Varvelt, it needs to free itself from its bindings, much like Mimihagi does as well. Only Pernida's bindings are a bit more literal, with actual chains attached to its fingernails that it forcibly breaks open. This seal seemed to be preventing the left arm from growing gigantic in size, possibly preventing its progression powers completely and only allowing it access to the nerve aspect of the compulsory for the time being. What's interesting about this is that Pernida forces its own fingers out violently by pushing them open with its own nerves. You can see them running up the base of each finger, allowing it to shatter the chains, but who bound it originally? And when they did bind it, did they know that it would be fairly simple for Pernida to simply break out of it should it actually want to? Presumably it was Yuha bark, and this binding was something that Pernida either volunteered for or was happy to allow happen, at least for the time being, but again, we don't know. Unless, unlike the right arm, the left arm never escaped the clutches of the noble ancestors and they bound it, perhaps only heightening its aggression towards them. But this is all just speculation, mind you. Pernida's true identity is kept under wraps for a while after the character's actual introduction, as Pernida is introduced in chapter 599, making it technically the earliest time we see one of the Soul King's arms, though not body parts in general, as Gerard is introduced in the same double-page spread. However, Pernida was hooded at the time, and would remain so until long after Mimihagi had both been introduced and subsequently destroyed. Interestingly, there's a shot of the cloaked Pernida that shows a small humanoid hand emerging from the folds of its robes during this introductory chapter. While the community speculated on what this could be for a while, it was later confirmed to be a holdover from an idea that Kubo would later scrap, that the arms of the Soul King would have been able to take human form whenever they liked. Honestly, that would have been really cool to see, especially if said human form resembled a bastardized version of the Soul King. That could have been a kind of cool compromise to us actually being able to see the Soul King himself in battle. Regardless, Pernida helps Yuha bark and the other Schutzstaffel combat the Zero Division, initially using the compulsory to instantly destroy Senjumaru's second stage Divine Soldier reinforcement before being defeated by Oetsu, who launches his Zanpakuto into Pernida's hood, presumably stabbing it in the eye. When the Schutzstaffel are revived by Yuha bark's Auswählen, Pernida, whose true power has supposedly now been unlocked, though I'm not sure how that works considering Pernida didn't receive its power from Yuha bark in the first place, uses the compulsory to tear open Hikafune's cage of life, releasing Yuha bark and the other Quincy from confinement. The Zero Division are intimately tied to the Royal Palace, the Royal Palace's existence, and the existence of the Soul King, so a part of me wonders, could they not sense that they were coming up against one of the Soul King's renegade limbs? That seems a little odd to me. Maybe they didn't sense it, they didn't have time to sense it, or the fact that its power was being sealed maybe meant they couldn't sense it. And from here, Pernida participates in the conquering of the Royal Palace, though several clues to its true identity are dropped by Kubo throughout the assault. For starters, when the floor of the palace crumbles beneath it, the left arm simply drops off the edge with the debris, seemingly unable to even move or do anything about it. As the cloaked Pernida just drops into the abyss below, it has to be rescued by Gerard on his way up. Admittedly, this does pose even more questions. Pernida must be able to move a bit, or else how did it sneak up behind Yoruichi? The other members of the Schutzstaffel hadn't arrived yet, so it can't have been carried there. And later, when Yuha bark demonstrates his newfound power by blasting away the top of the palace, Pernida clings onto a piece of rock with what we originally thought was its head, though the outline of two fingers can clearly be seen now beneath the hood. Once Yuha bark creates the fortress of Varvel and rebuilds the royal palace, Pernida faces off against Mayuri and Nemu, where its true identity is finally revealed. Of course, I've gone over this fight in considerable detail before on the channel, so I won't do that again here, but we see that Pernida has two irises in its sole gargantuan eye, unlike Mimihagi's one. And as mentioned earlier, where Mimihagi's eye is on the back of its hand, Pernida's is on the palm. Pernida's innate power of progression is shown off to great effect in this battle, as it continuously evolves throughout the course of the fight. Whether that's by rapidly growing brand new versions of itself every time a piece of its body is severed, or by learning from and adapting the mannerisms and abilities of those it connects with through its nerves, Pernida's power makes it a truly terrifying opponent. This is a slight offshoot, but the fact that two of the Soul King's disembodied body parts were strong enough to be considered among the absolute elite of the Vandenreich goes to show just how omnipotent the Soul King must have have been when truly whole. And it also makes me wonder if he himself had access to these particular powers. With his left arm, was he able to use the compulsory like Pernida uses it, and did his heart allow him to effectively use the miracle? I've no idea. Honestly, it seems kind of likely though, considering he is the closest thing to God. Throughout the fight, Pernida reinstates its allegiance to the Quincy, as well as that being its true identity, showing that it's learned the ability to form and use a heilig bogen of its own with considerable skill. While it might seem like a bit of a coincidence that two of the Soul King's disparate body parts would find their way into Yhwach's army, potentially even three, if Gremmy really is the brain of the Soul King, it also makes sense that those remnants of the Soul King that remember their hatred of the Shinigami would side with their own son in his quest for revenge. But eventually, after a brutal and lengthy fight, Mayuri is able to turn Pernida's evolution against it and kill the left arm of the Soul King, presumably once and for all. This is obviously quite a big deal. For starters, Mayuri has basically succeeded in killing a god. And secondly, after the death of the Soul King himself, these limbs lived on after him in the world of Bleach. But with both the left and right arms seemingly destroyed completely now, the rest of Reio is being wiped out from existence. Honestly, I know that Pernida was eventually trapped in essentially an infinite loop of constant evolution and then destruction, but I have to imagine Mayuri would have really tried to salvage some of it to take back to his lab. And finally, at least as far as the source material goes, we have the Soul King's heart. Now, I'm a little more jaded when it comes to this one, Gerard Valkyrie being the heart of the Soul King, or at the very least a retainer for it, much like Ukitake became for the right arm, is a cool enough idea, but virtually no time is dedicated to this at all. In fact, it kind of felt like Kubo just dropped this reveal in there last minute to help justify what Gerard's powers were essentially going to be moving forward. And while it's never actually confirmed outright in the source material that Gerard is the Soul King's heart, Askin muses that he and the other sternritter have long suspected it, due to Gerard's own strange innate abilities. Much like Pernida, he too had his powers long before Yhwach gave him a shrift, and again, like Pernida before him, Gerard's the miracle is merely for show. But that's really it, and ironically, Gerard ends up being more of a mystery than even the right and left arms themselves. I want to speculate on Gerard a little bit, however, and give my opinion as to what I think is going on with this really weird character. For starters, Gerard being the heart, or at least having an ability that centers on the heart or the core of a being, is seemingly confirmed when Zaraki bifurcates him in Bankai, splitting Gerard down the middle. When Gerard resurrects, he does so thanks to a Quincy cross that seems to just be floating in midair, right where Gerard's own heart should be. That cross pulls his body back together, drawing his blood towards it, causing the giant's corpse to rise up and reform in a brilliant angelic light, granting him even more strength and power than before. Of course, the heart is a well-known symbol of life, of vitality, and Gerard's the miracle allows him to revive seemingly without limit. Even if he's clearly killed, he will return to life. In fact, as I mentioned in my in-depth video of Gerard's own fight, he's killed on 3 separate occasions by the captains before being finally finished off by Yhwach himself, who literally strips Gerard of his power and his flesh. In fact, I think there's an interesting comparison to be made here too. Gerard being able to continuously revive like this is something we really don't see much of in Bleach, when he's actually obviously killed. And of course, the kind of closest counterpart to this is Aizen being continuously revived by the Hogyoku, which in some ways I'd say is analogous to the idea of a constantly beating heart that continuously brings its host back to life, much in the same way as Gerard's gigantic Quincy cross seemingly does as well. And I believe in Can't Fear Your Own World it's mentioned that remnants of the Soul King were used in part towards the building of the Hogyoku, so it kind of comes together and works better than you might think. Basically what I'm getting at is that Gerard's power is almost like the living embodiment of a Hogyoku in a sense. But as for Gerard himself, well, there's something really strange going on. Certainly on the outside, he appears to be human. Sure, his outfit is either really outdated or a bad cosplay, but that's likely Kubo's way of alluding to Gerard being ancient. Though even that is a cause for question. Hashwolf and Basby's flashback takes place in the human world roughly 1,000 years ago, and they dress surprisingly modern. Are we meant to think Gerard is from some medieval period of time that apparently took place even further back than 1,000 years? Anyway, my main point isn't really about his dress sense. It's that when you look a little closer, things get pretty weird and unnatural. For starters, and most obviously, Gerard's eyes are extremely unusual and like nothing else we've ever seen. They're totally blank, and as mentioned before, each of the Soul King's parts seems to have a different number of irises. The right arm has 1, the left arm has 2, Yhwach has 3, while the king himself has 4. So maybe Gerard is the unlucky one to have none at all. But that's not even the weirdest part about it. His eyes look completely fake to me. There's clearly some movement there as Kubo draws them in a way that shows they can move and swivel to look at things, but they look like they're made of plastic or something. They've got an almost alien appearance, and they have a peculiar outer layer surrounding them, as if one part of his eyes is raised up compared to the rest. It gets even weirder though, when Gerard dies, and his spiritual body is pulled apart. This is easier to see in the coloured version. The topmost layer of his eyes is sucked away, but the rest seemingly remains, as if only the top part of his eye is, I guess, living. On closer inspection, a part of me even wonders if he has eyes at all, or if it's just an odd way of drawing the kind of cavity where his eyes should be. As you can see, when his skeleton collapses to the ground upon his actual death, it kind of looks like at least a piece of his eye is still in there, unless that is supposed to just be the back of his eye socket. Very, very weird. Really kind of confusing. And next, if you look closely, you'll notice Gerard doesn't have any fingernails once he's activated his Volstendig. It's almost as if he's an artificial human, a fake, a creation built to house the heart of the Soul King. So here's my own theory, and this is purely speculation on my part, but I think Gerard was probably a real human at some point who was killed maybe in valiant, glorious battle. However, he was resurrected when the heart of the Soul King was bestowed upon his body, when he was chosen to be its retainer and he became its vessel. So, in a sense, now he's like an undying golem of sorts, charged with defending the Quincy King until his dying breath and even beyond, only able to be finally destroyed when his core is smashed to pieces. It's hard to say if the heart of the Soul King influenced Gerard's actions at all. Did he already know of Yhwach and the Quincy? Was he already a Quincy before he received the heart? If the heart is like the left and right arms, then does it too have eyes? Are we literally talking about a heart with a giant eye that can also change forms to possess someone? So yeah, Gerard is a really weird one. Honestly, one of the characters I would love to get some concrete answers on the most, and his trajectory in the story follows almost the exact same path as Pernida's, what with them being in the same faction. The main difference is, like I mentioned before, outside of Askin's kind of off-the-cuff remark, there's really no real indication about Gerard being the Soul King's heart, and it's never really mentioned again either. And that's essentially it as far as the source material is concerned regarding the disparate body parts of the Soul King, but there's a bit more in the novel Can't Fear Your Own World. To begin with, the Soul King apparently had a Seketsu, or a chain of fate, which is weird to me, as that would imply seemingly that he is, well, just like everybody else. While a human has an actual chain that connects them to their spiritual body, the Seketsu specifically refers to the place on a Shinigami where their chain once resided. And I suppose that is possible, since the Soul King is meant to be the being from which all of these races bore out of at some point. However, what confuses me about the Soul King having a Seketsu is you would assume a Seketsu only came about as a result of the creation of the cycle of life and death, as it showcases the difference between a human and their soul form. And the Soul King helped bring about the cycle of life and death himself, and his entire purpose now is to help regulate that flow of souls. So I don't really see how he could have had a Seketsu if that cycle didn't exist before he made it so. And I do wonder what losing his Seketsu would do to his overall Reiryoku, considering we actively see his power uncorked in the source material, and it is monstrously overwhelming. It can't have had a truly detrimental effect, unless it was somehow even greater than that before. Perhaps the Soul King also possesses a Hakusui that he'd have to lose to for it to affect his Reiryoku or spiritual power. As we know, the destruction of both the Seketsu and the Hakusui of a Shinigami will result in them losing their powers completely, and even the ability to become a Shinigami later on again. Either way, the Soul King Seketsu would eventually bond with the Fullbringer Aura Michibane, and it seems likely that possessing this piece of Reio is the reason for Aura's incredible spiritual power. Secondly, there are the Soul King's nails, which admittedly isn't a pleasant image. It's hard to know what it means exactly by nails, whether they're literal fingernails, or more likely just fragments, pieces of the Soul King himself that were scattered throughout the worlds. When these fragments bond with humans, they have the power to transform them into Fullbringers, and the nails were also sought after by both Aizen and Tokinada for their schemes. And then finally, though this one is speculative as it was never actually confirmed even in the novel, but it seems likely that Gremi Thamo played host to the brain of the Soul King, as we mentioned briefly earlier on. To me, this one seems to make a lot of sense, if not for any other reason than the strangeness of the circumstances surrounding Gremi himself. When the Sternritter dies in battle with Zaraki, we were all perplexed to see his imagined body vanish, leaving a literal brain in a jar lying there on the ground. For the remainder of the source material, the brain, annoyingly, receives no explanation whatsoever, as though its random appearance is something we should just accept. But for this to be the Soul King's brain makes sense to me. The power of the Visionary is so unbelievably godlike that it fits Reio perfectly and slots in nicely alongside the innate abilities of Pernida and Gerard. For the god of the Bleach universe to be capable of just imagining something into reality really works for me. There are some oddities though. If Gremi is in fact a creation of the Soul King's brain, did the brain itself gain sentience at some point? And if so, is this another example of a Sternritter having their abilities before Yhwach gave them a shrift? Is the Visionary an honorary shrift like the Miracle and the Compulsory? If it is, why didn't Askin mention it? Is it because he was only discussing the Schutzstoffel specifically at the time? I suppose all of that is absolutely possible. And also, if this is the sentient brain of the Soul King just creating a body for itself in the form of Gremi, then, much like Pernida, is this the Soul King talking to Zaraki during their battle? Even if perhaps he doesn't really know it at the time, although it certainly seems like Gremi is self-aware enough to know that Gremi is just an imagined being and not technically real. Also, lastly, what's going on with the size of the Soul King? Both Pernida and Mimihagi seem to be absolutely massive, or at least can assume an enormous form. Pernida especially is odd, as even in its chained up state, it's a hand that's effectively the size of a human. So was the Soul King originally colossal too? Was it his sealing and butchering at the hands of the ancestors that shrunk him down? Meanwhile though, the brain in the jar is normal sized. Again, maybe the jar is acting as a seal here. But we're really getting into the weeds now. This is murky water for sure. We can only hope that we get some more concrete, definitive answers in the upcoming 1000-Year Blood War anime. But that's it for the video, guys. I really hope you enjoyed it, taking a look at the sentient body parts of the Soul King himself, going into more detail about them, taking a look at everything we know about them in the source material and the light novels as well. Hopefully I didn't miss anything out. This has been a fairly long video, and I hope it was at least somewhat useful for you as well. Hopefully you took something of value away from it. I enjoyed doing a little bit of speculation on them as well, as there really is so much we have yet to know about these individual body parts, and like I said, I really hope the anime expands on it even a little bit more. But let me know your thoughts and feelings down in the comments below. How do you feel about the body parts of the Soul King? Do you agree with my speculation on characters like Gerard, Mimihagi, even Gremmy as well? I'd love to know your thoughts down below. Let me know which one of the body parts is your favourite, which one do you think is the most powerful. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on all of these topics and questions down below. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. Give the video a thumbs up. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. And I'll see you then.